And thank you for joining us. I'm Rachel Verdin. I'm a research fellow at the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. The event is part of our Digit Debate series from the Digit Centre, and we're working alongside the Institute of Development Studies, and we're going to be thinking today about the impacts of digital exclusion across Sussex. So by way of an introduction, I'm going to briefly set the scene for our debate. We've all seen how digital solutions are increasingly being adopted in all walks of life. Since 2010 in the UK, the government's stated aim has been digital by default. That's been intended to increase efficiency, to make services easier and simpler to use. And over the course of the pandemic, we've seen how those transformations have escalated even further. Over the last year, 1.5 million more people in the UK are online, and we've seen 5 years worth of progress in terms of digital capabilities. So on the one hand, we see how COVID has been both a driver and a barometer of success in terms of people's ability to access universal credit, and in the ways that people have been able to adapt through the transformations. So while digital solutions can foster opportunities, gaps do still remain, perhaps for those who don't have the motivation or the skills needed to access that shift online, or who don't have the hardware or the software needed to connect. There's a really useful digital index by Lloyds, which is going to be published tomorrow. And in the midst of the cost of living crisis, it's this year going to include an element on cost and affordability. In one of our earlier Digit debates, we heard from the fantastic Helen Milner from Good Things Foundation and Al Mathers from the RSA, and they talked broadly about the digital divide. We know that 5% of the population aren't internet users, and that group is marked by intersectional inequalities, so factors like your age and your income level and your job type, but also the region that you live in. We also know that digital capability isn't a permanent state. The tech around us is continually changing, and as a population, we need to keep up and ensure that learning is ongoing. The event today is part of the Festival of Science, and we're supported by the Economic and Social Research Council. The festival is an annual celebration of the social sciences and a key element of the ESRC's commitment to promote awareness of UK social science research to new audiences. It runs until the 13th of November, and we'll put a link in the chat where you can find out about other events. The theme for this year's local festival is My Local Area, and we're here to ask today what these gaps mean for local communities here in Sussex. We know cities like Cambridge and Manchester are doing brilliantly at drawing in funding, and new tech businesses are thriving. Indeed, in the digital economy and tech sector in Sussex is worth over £1 billion annually. We perform really well. The South East is typically in the top 3 of the local digital capital index. So we do have strengths, but we could also do better. Not everyone is part of that digital transformation. So what does that mean locally? We're going to explore today what that means for people in Sussex. And to help us think about that, we're drawing on research carried out by Dr. Becky Faith and Kevin Hernandez in conjunction with Digital Brighton and Hove and Citizens Online. We also have a great panel of experts, and they're going to give us some different perspectives on the problem. So we're going to be hearing first up from Dr. Becky Faith from the Institute of Development Studies, then Simon Hughes, who's a director at Mid Sussex District Council, and Emma Daniel, who's a partnerships manager at Citizens Advice Brighton and Hove. And our panel are going to talk about the kind of strategies and innovations that are being pursued locally and how these divisions and gaps translate here in Sussex, what they look like at that kind of local government level, and how pockets of inequality manifest for different communities across the region. Once we've heard from the panel, we'll have lots of time for questions and discussions. But up first, let me introduce Becky. She's a research fellow and co-leader at the Digit Centre of the Digital and Technology Cluster. And Becky is going to be presenting some of her research looking into digital poverty in low-income households in Brighton and Hove. She's going to set out some of her findings and how we need to be prioritising digital inclusion here in Sussex. So Becky, if I can hand over to you now.
Thanks, Rachel. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. So I'm Dr. Becky Faith from IDS and the University of Sussex, and I'm going to be talking about what I now realise should have been called A Tale of Two Digital Cities, but it's too late to change the title. And we're talking about two different faces of the digital economy in the two digital cities in Brighton. And this is part of a reflection on my own experiences of living in Brighton for almost 30 years, having worked in the tech sector myself, and now a researcher looking at digital inequalities. So the research that I'm talking about today is from the Digital Futures at Work Research Centre. We also got some funds from the University of Sussex during COVID to distribute tablets to disconnected citizens through Digital Brighton and Hove. We've also been doing some work funded by the British Academy on digital poverty. So that's where the data is coming from. So I'm going to be talking today about two kind of different digital cities in Brighton. The first one talking about our research and on who's left behind in Brighton. And then secondly, kind of reflecting a bit on the kind of digital success and the digital economy in Brighton, and just thinking about how we reconcile those two realities. So who's left behind in digital transformation? So the kind of big story, as we've just been hearing about, that digital connectivity is not a luxury anymore. So with the removal of face-to-face services, which was accelerated by the pandemic, now everything from like seeing your doctor to welfare provision is online. And they're touted as like often delivering this kind of dual benefit of they're both efficient, saving money, and delivering better kind of customer focused service. And often you'll get those two things kind of concatenated. And I think it's really important sometimes to separate that out. And our research found that this idea of like delivering better services wasn't found in the experience of very many marginalised communities, and that there's an increased burden on third sector organisations such as CAB and intermediaries that we interviewed during the pandemic. So we spoke to organisations who were supporting job seekers, we spoke to people in the council, people who were doing kind of voluntary support in kind of digital champions. And this is what we found, that lots of people were getting left behind. And this is a quote from one of our respondents, all going to be anonymous, who felt that when everything became kind of digital during the pandemic, he felt that the idea of public service is to help those who are least able to help themselves, and that this kind of shift to digital service provision, which was happening before the pandemic and was accelerated, was excluding those who most needed to be included. So some great data from a really excellent report that I need to thank Emma for, because I've used it a lot. From when there's a link, I've shared a PDF of these slides and there's a link. So this is from the CAB report on kind of the cost of living in Brighton. So this is just talking about the kind of bigger picture on poverty inequalities. This is in Brighton, not more broadly in Sussex. So poverty in Brighton is much worse than before the pandemic, and particularly this relates to kind of issues around housing. Almost 30% of people are living in private rented accommodation, and we can see there's the data from Emma's report on just how much these annual increases are in people's rents. You can see like for a one-bedroom flat that's going up 25%, and our wages definitely aren't going up 25%. Also in education, some really fantastic work that's being done by Class Divide on educational inequalities in Brighton, particularly looking at people in East Brighton and the educational inequalities they experience. So East Brighton's in the top 10 least economically advantaged areas in the country, 43% of children living in the ward living in poverty. And here's some sort of data on the educational inequalities young people in this area experience. And if we go on to think about what that means for the digital economy, obviously to doing any kind of work, you need a decent set of grades at GCSE English and Maths. So we can see that there's a large group of young people in our city who are being left behind already, age 16, because only 37% of them are getting the basic grades they need. And I would really recommend looking at the Class Divide website and looking at the campaigns they're running. So we've also been doing quite a lot of work on digital poverty and the cost of living crisis, and we did some research and got some data in March, but I'm actually using the more up-to-date data from Ofcom's affordability research in September 22, which was just done in September, just recently released in September, sorry, because this is more up-to-date, and it's now showing that 8 million households are finding it difficult to afford communication services. And I'm really excited that Simon's going to be talking a bit about affordability when it comes to the work that he's doing in Mid Sussex, because we're seeing that this issue of digital poverty, which we see as alongside fuel poverty, other sort of health poverty, period poverty, we should be thinking about digital poverty alongside these issues. And the people who are most likely to be having difficulty younger adults, people with children, people on benefits, and people with disabilities. And some of those communities line up with other aspects of digital exclusion. Disabled people are among the most digitally excluded communities in this country. So just a kind of really hyper local example of how we see like this idea of the poor pay more and the digitally poor pay more, that if you haven't got access to a smartphone or you can't afford the data, you end up paying more for things. Often it's because you can't search online or you can't use kind of sort of comparison websites. But even in Brighton, if you've got the bus app, you can get a saver, a day saver, a city saver for £5, but if you use cash, it's £5.50. And that might seem like a kind of small local example, but that's quite a hefty percentage more for the kind of privilege of using cash. And I suppose we should be count ourselves lucky that we can still use cash on the buses in Brighton, as you can't in a lot of places, but it does show how the digitally poor and the digitally excluded pay more. So here's a bit of theory, because this is an ESRC event, that we see this kind of vicious circle of the way that digital poverty and the fact that we're expected to do things online, it makes life more expensive and convenient, not just for those who are digitally excluded by monetary poverty, but people who are digitally excluded for reasons other than poverty, for a lack of digital skills, or for a lack of just like can't be bothered or just not into it, or for other reasons, or for services not being designed in an inclusive fashion. In contrast to this, we have a whole different digital city. We have this, the digital, what we used to call in the 1990s Silicon Beach, and I don't think we call it that anymore. When I used to work in the tech sector in Brighton, but it's carried on being a really, really flourishing digital sector, and this is recognised in the council's economic strategy, and they're saying here that it's got national recognition, and there's an exciting opportunity to leverage greater value from these activities. So there's a real kind of like citywide excitement as ever about the digital economy in Brighton and how it can contribute to local economic growth. And so some data on Brighton, it was 1.4 times more concentrated locally than nationally. So there's about 7,000 jobs, and it's seen as one of 6 sectors that's fundamental to the local economy. And I have to say, support from Wired Sussex, which has been going for years, and the University of Sussex, Digital Catapult, from these sort of local, as well as from the university, these local organisations, is absolutely vital to the kind of success of the digital economy here. And within that digital economy, there's people doing really good work addressing inequalities and ensuring the kind of doing what they can to ensure the kind of maximum inclusion in the digital economy. So, for example, just a plug here for the Wired Sussex Talent Fest, which is coming up next week. I urge you all to go and sign up. Events like Code Bar, where you're getting like underrepresented communities more involved in tech. So there's lots of really exciting work and meetups and hubs that happen in this city, partly because it's a kind of groovy liberal place, and that's what people want to kind of give something back to the economy. So how do we reconcile these two cities, these sort of 2 pictures that I've painted of a city in which there's like increasing poverty, that even if you do get a great job in the digital economy, housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable. So some theory, again, this is a social science event, and some kind of theoretical ideas that we use to talk about these issues, so that we see how digital poverty and exclusion amplify other aspects of inequality. So even the basic things, it makes it harder to get access to healthcare if you can't use your GP's terrible online software for getting access to an appointment. No, I'm not going to start ranting about that, because I could take up the rest of the hour. So this idea that digital inequalities make other aspects of inequality worse. And there's another idea that the kind of privileged insiders, so this idea that there's links between social and digital exclusion and social and digital inequalities, there's kind of privileged insiders in the digital economy, that they are shaping the terms of engagement in digital society. And that doesn't just mean the top decision makers in government, but it means everybody who's designing the software, might be designing the terrible GP software that I don't want to moan about, influencing service design. So those privileged insiders might well be people who are working in the digital economy in this city. And we've been talking about how myself and Kevin, my co-author, have been talking about people are what we're describing as adversely incorporated into digital society. So you're forced to use these digital tools, but they might well come at a financial cost, often at a psychological cost, because it can be really stressful using poorly designed technologies. Also means that many people who are digitally excluded are reliant on intermediaries in the overstretched voluntary sector. And there's great work done by my colleagues at Digital Brighton and Hove to support these communities. I would really say they do absolutely fantastic work, but the voluntary sector and the community sector is really stretched. So just to kind of finish, a couple of voices from our research. This is quite a critical one for the university's staff here. So someone talking about these, this was at the kind of height of lockdowns, but I think it says something interesting about the role of the university in the city. I see the irony of this hugely wired up institutions, these buildings that can be literally across the road from the pathetic community centre that is saying, oh, can we have a few more computers so the kids don't have computers at home on this estate, can do their homework. So he's talking about this kind of contrast between the kind of vast resources of the universities and the people who have, and the kind of vast kind of technological and social and knowledge capital we have. And maybe we should be thinking about how we can redistribute that more fairly. And someone else talking about what digital exclusion strategies used to look like in the city, maybe at the height of the kind of Blair government and their time when there was lots more money for a real kind of citywide commitment to overcoming digital exclusion, which we are now seeing in places like Manchester, where Andy Burnham is like doing incredible work on this. And this respondent said they need to pick up what was left off, because I remember 10 years ago, they're looking very strategically across the city, and it needs to be strategic and not pockets of money. And people in the voluntary sector often complain about, like, yeah, there's lots of little pockets of money, but the kind of overheads and just applying for everything. And Wi-Fi for all, this idea of like, why not just give kind of free broadband? And it's interesting that in the States, as part of Biden's infrastructure work, he's brought in a package whereby low-income communities can get really cheap, really fast Wi-Fi for like $30 a month or something, and get $100 off equipment, of laptops and tablets. And that's on a national scale. So that just goes to show that these things are possible if the political will is there. And that's my rant over. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. That's some really interesting research, and that idea of two cities and how we reconcile the gap between the haves and the have-nots is hopefully something we can pick up in the Q&A. So we're going to, before we get to that, I'd like to turn next to Simon Hughes. Obviously, if you've got any questions now, please pop them in the chat and we'll come to them in due course. But for now, if I can turn to Simon. Simon has worked in social enterprises, government and health. He has an interest in how communities innovate and collaborate. While his career started in mental health, where he sought to redesign services to better meet the needs of those who use them, he's gone on since to work in housing and other services for vulnerable people, and he's now a director at Mid Sussex District Council. He's also a trustee of Stay Up Late UK, and perhaps he'll share some of the work he does at Gig Buddies. But by way of an introduction, perhaps, Simon, you could share some of your insights into the question of digital inclusion or levelling up, and how
Certainly.
Mid-Sussex.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, yeah, as you said, my involvement has been, you could describe it as a bit boring at the start. So I work for Mid Sussex, so we're sandwiched in between basically Brighton and London, with Gatwick to the side. And the issues that we faced are somewhat different from Brighton. And this is way back in many moons ago, pre-COVID, 2019, if you can remember that far back. And the issue that we had wasn't just around digital exclusion, digital poverty. It was around what's happening with the market around digital infrastructure. And for those of you that with an economics background have taken interest in this market, it's a bit of the Wild West, really, in that basically digital connectivity goes either between banks in different parts of the world, or in high dense communities, so mostly cities. And then where it goes in cities, it gets overbuilt. So you get lots of people trying to build there, connect up with businesses and flog people, effectively fast connections for media. But if you're in a town or a village or in any rural area, the chances of having any digital connectivity, so I include mobile in this, is pretty low, and it's unlikely to be any good. So that's an issue for us, or was an issue for us back in 2019, for all those reasons, but also for economic development reasons. And so we worked with the government to put in fibre connectivity. And just a very quick reason as to why that's important is that all the digital infrastructure, whether you're on a mobile phone, Wi-Fi, you name it, it all connects to this basically fibre in the ground, which is, if you like, the motorways of digital infrastructure. So it all eventually travels along fibre, either to another part of the world or within the UK, Europe, etc. So the issue for us was, how do we connect up and how do we get the market interested in our location? Because if you've got services that, not just public services, but other services that are increasingly being delivered through digital connectivity, then not having any is a bit of a problem. Not just for those businesses or public services, but critically for the people that you're providing services to. So that's the problem we tried to solve. And the first bit is, how do you get that stuff in the ground? But the way we wanted to approach it wasn't simply, let's spend ages spending all these millions of pounds putting stuff in the ground, and then 3 or 4 years down the line, we'll have the stuff in the ground, and then people have connectivity. And by that time, a lot of people's lives have gone, a lot of the things that they need, a lot of the services they need to have access to, the time has gone for them, or things have got more acute, especially if you're in healthcare. So, what we did is we saw this trend, we mapped this trend, we built business cases and saw, I mean, this is just a sort of, probably something that I remember. See, I remember when a mobile phone didn't exist. You basically, when you rang people, you're ringing a place, usually someone's hall or an office. Whereas now, if you ring a mobile device, you're ringing a person. They're very personalized, but there was a time when that wasn't the case. But basically, over this period, lots and lots of services are incorporating mobile data. It doesn't really matter what it is. If you've got a wearable, so one of these things, I've been involved in long-term health conditions, and wearables are being developed in the NHS so that you can manage long-term health conditions in real time. And that means that acute care or any acute interventions are less likely. So that's great for the individual and good for the service. It means you can intervene at a much earlier stage. For example, if, let's say, blood pressure, those sorts of things, and it costs less and it's better for the individual, but you can't do that if you don't have connectivity. So the way we approach this was to say, if we're successfully getting this millions of pounds from government, how can we start delivering some of the things we want to achieve? So tackling things like digital exclusion, digital poverty from the outset. And how do you do that when you haven't got good digital connectivity? And effectively, we used this, this model which we worked up, which to look at how could we link both the economic and the social impact of this work. And so in creating the infrastructure, what you see in economic terms is a short-term boost to the economy. So you're spending money with businesses, they're making a profit, they're employing people. And that's the red blob there you see. Then you get the orange stuff, which is businesses, public services, people start to change what they do because they have connectivity. They get an app for the bus. They can email people. They can get cheaper things that they purchase. They can contact people for services. They can do all those sorts of things, providing they've got the kit, obviously. And then you get much more significant digital technology adoption. So these are the massive changes that happen that we've seen certainly across the last 5 to 10 years. And you get new technologies that suddenly come into the fore, like quantum technology, those sorts of things. So we were very much at the red end of this graph, saying, okay, what do we do from the outset to have an impact on our communities? And so what we did is we decided that when we constructed the contract for basically putting optical fibre in the ground, we would make it a condition of that contract that the contractor use some of that money to tackle the issues around digital exclusion and digital poverty. So they had to do that as part of that contract. And that's a significant element of what public services do in contracts. There's a social value element to what we do. Sometimes, to be frank, we've been pretty rubbish at it. And, you know, because it's hard to do, you haven't got much money to start with. So you're thinking, if I can get someone to do this work, that would just be brilliant. But then trying to get them to do something else would be super hard. But what we did is we decided that, to be honest, there was no point embarking on this unless we really worked with businesses and said, okay, what can you deliver under social value, or what does that mean for you as a business? And to be blunt, there's an economic advantage for them to do that, especially now. So we're reasonably successful in doing that, and I want to just take you through a few examples of what we did. So we have a range of programs, and we worked with a framework. So when you procure things in public services, there are some pre-agreed, if you like, contracts, which so it's pre-agreed on cost, on who the businesses are that can do it, etc. So it makes it much quicker to do, but also means you're not spending all that time on the legals and lots of negotiations. You can spend it more on what are the works you're trying to do and what else you want to achieve. And so we worked with Balfour Beatty, which is certainly pan-Europe, does a lot of civil construction work, bridges, roads, you name it. And they actually haven't done digital infrastructure work before. And so we worked through basically 5 things we wanted them to achieve. One was to do with our economic aspirations, which was to, in over 90% of the money we were spending had to be spent with local businesses. So anyone, you know, local businesses that would dig up roads, splice fibre, do all those communications, all those sorts of things. And the reason for that is that means that immediately the money we're spending delivers some economic growth to the local area, as opposed to you know, elsewhere in the country or across the world. We then wanted money to be spent with voluntary community and social enterprises, and to build their capacity. So that's to be able to fund additional posts for them, but also provide training and equipment. And also we wanted them to work for science, technology, etc., with younger people who didn't necessarily have access to developing those skills. And then we wanted digital inclusion. So actually, how can you support some of those voluntary and community and social enterprises to train people to then go out and to talk to the people they already work with around digital skills, and also provide equipment. So we built that into the contract that we set. And this is just this was the early stage back in 2020 when we were building this. So it's really early. This is probably about 3 months in to when the work started. And so at the time COVID was coming in, so we changed some of that work so that the people would support food banks, invest in digital training champions for voluntary and community agencies, so they could go out and support people critical during COVID. As you'll know, more people went online, which is great if you knew how to and you had the kit to. But that also meant people could have free internet access. We're able to do that through basically through mobile devices. So previously, people that just can't afford a connection could have that for free. And then distributed IT equipment, actually from local providers who had decommissioned equipment. Often businesses will decommission tablets, laptops, phones after 2 or 3 years, because that's the sort of tax advantageous time to do it. So it's stuff that still works. It's great. You're not going to play online role-playing games very well on them, but most people don't want to. They just want to get in contact with their GP or get some advice around revenues and benefits, those sorts of things. And all these devices are super good for that. So we had local firms distributing some from other businesses to people in the community that needed it. And we also did that through primary schools. And so we were starting to see, this is even before, this is when people were digging up roads, we started to see an impact of this work as this went underway. And then we also worked on a social legacy. So actually, having some awards so that students could be paid for research and funded to do STEM studies. And we also then linked that to mental health training as well for a whole array of people. It's a significant issue, still is a significant issue, and will be because of COVID and the isolation that presented. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what you can do from the outset with something that doesn't initially appear to be much at all to do with social issues around digital skills, poverty, etc. So you can actually, if you look at what you're trying to do strategically, look at what you're trying to achieve with those communities, you can look at pretty much any contract. I mean, this is a civils contract to do work, but my job is looking at all our contracts, leisure contracts, contracts around parks and open spaces, those sorts of things. And we can work with contractors in order to say, okay, how do we actually tackle some of these things within our community and develop digital inclusion and tackle digital poverty. And it is possible. I won't pretend it's easy, but it is absolutely possible. And if you go on things like the Social Value Portal, you'll see hundreds of examples, including in Manchester, Liverpool, Thameside, of how public services are trying to achieve this within the contracts they have and in the different areas and different geographies that they have. And this is moving on about a year. I'll only pull out a few of these, but basically, at this point, we were spending upwards of 3.5 million, of which most was spent with SMEs, and a significant element of that was used to support voluntary and community social enterprises. And I think I guess the thing I want to say is that this is just work that really has just started. So although ostensibly I could bore you with loads of stuff around splicing fiber and all techie stuff, actually that all counts for nothing. It's really, what does all that used for? Once you have infrastructure, and once you do things like we've done, where you're introducing infrastructure in a place where the market won't go, and all of that starts to then reduce the cost of entry to market for people providing connectivity, so their costs drop, which means they can provide cheaper connectivity. They can even, we're negotiating it now, provide Wi-Fi for free. It then starts to change what you can do and how you can work with communities to tackle some of these issues. So hopefully that's spurred some interest, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And that's really great ideas there for how that social value bit has been extended to help kind of bring in funding and get businesses on board to help with those transformations. Before we move on to the chat, can I introduce our final panelist, Emma Daniel. She's a partnerships manager at Citizens Advice, and she has a fantastic perspective where she can hopefully share some kind of insights about the welfare ecosystem across the city. As we mentioned, she's recently written a post-pandemic needs assessment outlining the scale of poverty in Brighton and Hove. So thank you, Emma, for finding the time to join us, and perhaps you can share some of your thoughts about how digitalisations kind of feature in that bigger picture story of inequality in Brighton and Hove. So over to you.
Thanks. So yeah, I've put a link to the report in the chat so people can read that in more detail. But what we needed to do last winter, spring, was assess the pressures across the pressure of poverty across all the kind of household income and expenditure that we were expecting to come up through this year. So all the things that are happening now with utility bills, mortgages and rents and all of these things, we had projected, and we wanted a one-stop shop to understand who was going to be most affected by the cost of living crisis, and any changes since before the pandemic, so to 2019, in the types of people who are most likely to be in poverty, so the cohorts of people that are at most risk. So in essence, there isn't a significant change. The people that were in most poverty before the pandemic are in more poverty now. So those households are most likely to be single parents, households where somebody has a disability, and households where the head of household is from a BAME community. What's changed is that their poverty is likely to be much deeper. And what's changed during the course of this year is that they're most likely to be in negative budgets month in, month out. That is that the money they have coming in is lower than their bills. And there's nothing that we can do in terms of getting more benefits in and that sort of thing, and it's more difficult to give debt advice when people are in that situation as well. So the sort of tools that we have as an advice sector to offer those households are much fewer. So there's a cohort who are in, extreme need now. To just get a sort of sense of scale, the poverty figures for children in poverty for the Hove and Pavilion sections of the city are at a quarter of children. And in Kemp Town, which is includes Moulscombe and Bevendine and the sort of areas surrounding the main university campuses, it's at 32%. Now, those figures are out of date, and we think that is likely to rise because the levels of children on free school meals have risen quite significantly last year, and we expect those to rise again. So we see that the cohort of people in poverty is bigger. The factors, the type of household you are remain the same, but that will determine whether you're in periodic problems or in deep poverty. So what we're seeing is two cohorts: a cohort of people who are in deep, persistent poverty. Every month is a difficult month for them, and that is bigger and a worse problem. And then a new cohort of people who are in a more precarious position, for whom sometimes some months they're in a negative budget, but other months they're just about getting by. Now, obviously, the two biggest pressures on people's income in the city and elsewhere are rents and utility bills. And just because they've gone up so much by over 50% or for utility bills, and for rents by up to 25%. So those two cost pressures are really big. Our city has a high dependence on private sector housing. As Becky said, 28% of all households are in private rented households. And just to give you some sense of scale, that is against a national average of 17%. So those high rents affect our city at a greater rate than other cities would be seeing. And also we have quite a young population, and young people have lower wages and lower benefits by design. So if you're under 23, your wages and benefits will be much lower, and yet your outgoings aren't discounted. For example, you're expected to spend the same amount on council tax and other bills as someone who's in a slightly higher income bracket, just by virtue of being that year older than you. So those are structural issues that affect our younger population. We found that even early sort of summer, people were voluntarily, I say voluntarily, it's not really voluntarily, but voluntarily turning off power in their homes. So not having the electricity on, not topping their meters up, not using refrigeration for food, using candles or camping lights rather than using overhead lights. So now, while that hasn't been such a specific problem during a long hot summer, it's certainly going to be a very significant problem during the winter. We're quite concerned about things like people having house fires, falls, other problems. And so I just want to come on to, so you get, I think, from what I've said, and I've only got like 10 minutes to talk altogether, that it's definitely Armageddon in terms of poverty in the city and anywhere else in the country. Our welfare ecosystem is breaking apart. We basically have clients that we cannot help, and we have fewer places to send them because food banks are filling up and closing their doors to new clients. So our options in terms of advice options are closing down. Our options in terms of emergency help and food help are closing down. We knew this would happen because we did the needs assessment and we warned everyone this would happen. And yet actually living it is very traumatic, actually, to be working in this field this year. In terms of thinking about the digital divide and what that bigger poverty picture means for us and what we would like to see organisations consider, is that when designing online solutions like GP surgeries or schools, for example, understanding that people will struggle with the cost of data and reliability of Wi-Fi in terms of designing websites, that most people will be accessing websites on their phone or someone else's phone in their household. So making it easy. School websites are a nightmare for downloading documents from. If a child is using their parents' phone by and large to do their homework or download tasks, that's an absolute nightmare. So I call that kind of a device poverty. In addition, it's making it's worse for children. Children can't choose certain GCSEs if they're in that situation. My daughter's doing an art GCSE. She has to print off a lot of things to do her homework and coursework. A child without access to a home printer is going to struggle to actually choose a GCSE subject like that, where you need to have access to a printer at home. So that's only going to get worse. So the divide between children who have the talents and the creative talents to get qualifications, and the children who have the access to a printer, that these things have big future implications for our future workforce. Because we're cutting a workforce off before they've even left school. Services should, schools and education settings should ensure that kids can use their mobile at school, which they all keep wanting to ban or have banned, and they should also ensure that the Wi-Fi is strong enough for children to access the internet at school and download things in order that they aren't disadvantaged. They should also allow children to charge their devices or phone battery banks, and you should also be encouraging people to use the electricity at work to charge devices and things like that if they want to, and make it part of the culture, because otherwise you will find that colleagues and stuff are struggling to have the same access that you do. I would say that obviously it's important to offer a free phone number or drop-in access to anything that you really want to make accessible to everybody. People that can go online will go online, because if you've made it easier, of course, which a lot of websites don't make it easier. But if you make it easier, most of us would much rather just do something quickly on our phone than bother staying on hold for an appointment or a drop-in. So, but those are essential to keep going for people that don't. But yeah, I think for me, my biggest worry for the future of the city is all those children and young people who have no electricity at home, never mind anything else, and how they're going to be doing their homework if they can't charge their phone at home because there's no electricity in the meter, which is the reality for a lot of households. So I'll finish there. Yeah, it's a very bad picture.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Emma. And that the desperate nature of the current situation is incredibly shocking. And your thoughts about how to access and how different people can access across Sussex is interesting for local councils to perhaps consider in terms of public points of access or charging facilities, and the idea around these kind of costs of maintaining connections. Anyway, thanks for everybody today. It would be great now if you're here, if you're able to turn your cameras on. I'm sure you all know the drill, but if you've got any questions, if you want to post them in the chat or raise your hand, and I can then call on you to ask your question. But I can see we've already got one here from Claire. If you would like to turn your mic on, Claire, and ask your question, please feel free.
Yes, I mean, I think it was prompted basically by the first talk, by Becky's talk. If there are these dimensions of exclusion in terms of digital connectivity, is it possible to pinpoint just what sorts of exclusion are more important? Because I think that'd be quite important for tackling them, basically.
I've got a quick response on that we don't have enough sort of well disaggregated data. But the big stories tend to be around disability and age. So disabled people are much more likely to be digitally excluded, and older people. But we're now seeing more and more of these issues that Emma's talking about, that like poverty is becoming an issue as well. People having to ration data, for example, or turn off broadband. But we don't have, although we have good digital exclusion data in this country from Ofcom and from the ONS, it's not very brilliantly disaggregated. It's often not disaggregated sort of locally as well. And I'm sure there's kind of issues, sort of geographical issues as well, to do with kind of patchy coverage, which I know you've done research on in rural areas.
Okay, I can see we've got another question here in the chat. Apologies if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but if Relitza, if you'd like to put your question to Emma and Simon. Hi there.
Hi everyone. I've been doing some work around zero-rated web services, and it's a bit like dialing 911. So you can dial it even if you don't have internet coverage or available minutes. So the idea is that these can be used on a more kind of permanent basis, rather than giving people prepaid SIM cards, making certain types of websites linked to education, let's say poverty advice, or even health advice, to be zero rated. That is, that no one would need data in order to access it. So I'll be very interested in hearing from Simon and Emma whether they think that there is scope to try to do something like this on a kind of regional level. Thank you.
Shall I go first, Emma? Okay. I think there is scope, definitely. The challenge we have, and it was touched on earlier, really, is that to do that you need some kind of connectivity, and we have not just ourselves, but West and East Sussex have mapped all sorts of connectivity across the whole of Sussex, and it's not great in some areas, as you would imagine. So it doesn't mean it's not the right thing to try and do. It simply means it doesn't solve the whole problem. Because if you've got no connectivity, then it doesn't matter what zero-rated stuff there is. You just can't get to it anyway. And then it's also the issue of having devices, and as we've heard earlier, having devices that are charged. So I think that in its own, yes, that's a good thing to do, but that it would need a range of other solutions to come to bear, so that it affects the widest range of people, really, or benefits the widest range of people. The other thing I'd add is that, and I don't know if anyone's doing any research on this, so apologies. What we're increasingly finding when we're trying to share information to different groups who might need access to it, it's understanding what communities of interest they're in and what communities of interest they're in digitally. So we know, for example, that if we want to send information about, say, revenues and benefits, discounts, concessionary stuff as a public service, then one of the most effective ways we've got is actually doing a short video on TikTok. because that's more likely to be seen and then shared with an adult. Now I haven't got brilliant data on that. That's something we're only just sort of looking at, but that whole point around, and it, obviously a big part of social science, looking at how do you get information shared and used by communities of interest in place, gives you some of those different solutions that will work across the board. I think I've probably rabbited on about that. So Emma, do you want to say something?
Sounds, I didn't know about it. I think it sounds really good. I think the idea that any statutory kind of service, including education, and potentially some charitable sector like our Citizens Advice website, for example, is well used across the country for information. I think the idea that that's free by default and is a good one. I think that in terms of making people's lives difficult, I think the main, I think we're trying to have a really good strategic discussion, but at the moment there's no strategy nationally. It's difficult to find strategy locally. I don't know how Simon's finding it, but certainly how we're finding life when you're trying to think big picture and think future is all we're getting is there's a policy vacuum, and then we're getting piecemeal help things. So we suddenly get an announcement that there's a few £1,000s to distribute from government to this group or to that group, which is really stifling strategic thinking about how you get beyond this 6-month period for us. So it's really hard for me to see beyond March, because there's no national strategy about how to tackle poverty and digital and public service provision and everything else. I love that idea and I think it's really good. I think the most important thing for most people who are stressed, anxious, poor, and struggling is difficulties of doing things online through really poorly designed sites, though, more than anything else.
Thank you. We've had a request from Samuel Manton, Simon, for you to share the report that you mentioned, highlighting the areas that are less connected in the region, if possible, please. If anyone else has any other questions, if they'd like to raise their hands. Jackie, do you want to jump in?
Well, first of all, can I say thanks for organising this session? I think it's absolutely fantastic, the range of different evidence you've brought to it in terms of empirically looking at what the gap means and also looking at what actors can do. And part of this event is also related to a European funded project we have, Euroship, which we can put details on. What I wanted to ask precisely to get a question is, we're looking to try and look across Europe as which countries are doing better or worse at part of this digital transformation. So the short question is, are there countries you look to say, hey, they're doing a really good job, there's something we can learn from them? And one of the ideas we're trying to pursue in the Euroship project is, and in Digit, is to look at digital ecospheres. So what's the relation between, for example, really simply, people at the core writing the semantic language that basically these systems can speak to each other technologically. Secondly, who are the types of organizations, often commercial organizations, putting those systems out? And then on the third rang are the kind of users. So how are the people like at your end trying to work with those different types of organizations to get a system that will speak to each other? And I just wondered if maybe one is, if you have any examples of where who's doing a good job, and secondly, how do you navigate with the relationships between all these different types of parties? Is that clear enough? It's a challenging question.
Yeah, that's a big question. How long have we got?
We've got about 2.5 minutes.
Very long. And we have one more question as well to come to, so a quick answer if at all possible.
Should I start? Is that all right, everyone? And I don't know if I'll answer, but I'm responsible often for some of the systems that we use, and we work with suppliers. And the world has changed. So revs and bends, for example, or revenues and benefits, or how you might book various things, how you might get advice. And the world's changed as more and more things move away from being hosted on a computer in someone's office, in a server room. They move into the cloud. It means that software becomes interoperable. They use something called, you've probably heard of them, APIs. And basically it means they can communicate more easily with each other. So that makes life a lot easier and a lot better. It means you don't have to go with one supplier. You can go with multiple ones and join stuff together in technical terms. The challenge comes with things like talking earlier, where it takes time for the market to develop. So if you're talking about things that are responsive design, so nerdy word for things that work on your mobile and shape and shift so they fit the size and type of device you've got. Often the market in local government certainly is, again, to use a technical word, completely rubbish and just pants at that. Because we don't have much money. So if you've got Revs and Bends, it's going to be provided by probably one of 3 companies. I won't give their names because they'll probably legally challenge me. And they've captured the market. They don't need it to be very good, because you can't get it from anyone else anyway. You can't buy it from anyone. You can't build it. So basically, you've got a market where it's not developing according to the need of the customer, because it doesn't need to. We can say as much as we want. We can put front ends on it, which are slightly better, but frankly not much, and pay through the nose to connect it to that system. So until the government, actually it's not fair to put on the government, but until the sector, so until local government gets going, actually this isn't good enough, we're going to start to shift the market, we can start to challenge the market, we can all work together, then those things don't change as they should do. The one area that is changing that and that is good at that is, there are pockets, more than pockets in the States, certainly around in the Scandinavian countries and increasingly here, and the government have part funded it. It's something called open source. So it's a type of software where you write it and it's available to everyone. So that makes it cheap. And you've got some of the best people who, because of their values, want to contribute to it. And that then reduces the cost of just having the software and means you can focus on user need. So I think there are examples, but the market in public sector, voluntary sector software is, it's just so hard that often we find ourselves fighting against what's available to us in order to meet a service need. Because we're just not, we can't employ loads of programmers and stuff. And I can't see that changing at anything like the pace it needs to be frank.
Thank you. Well, I'm mindful of time and aware that we should be finishing round about now, but I know that Adol put a question in the chat and I think there was one other one there. So if anyone is able to stay on for just a couple more minutes, perhaps if we could get some very quick answers, first to Adol and then lastly to Jessica's point, and then we will close. So Adol, if I can.
Yeah, thank you everyone. I just wondered about what the unit might be when we talk about the local, and whether anyone thinks this Greater Brighton idea through the Economic Board, for example, is a sensible one that makes sense for thinking about digital exclusion.
And Jessica, if you wanted to.
I think it does. Oh, did you want me to stop?
Sorry, could I just grab both of the questions quickly, and then if you can answer both if possible.
Yeah, I just, I was drafting the question as it was being sort of answered by Simon and Emma, because I found a lot of this in my doctoral research, which is actually looking at local government solutions during the pandemic and during Brexit, during an uncertain political climate, and what the responses is to digital regulation and implementing it. And what we found was that it was amazing what local government could do. And once they were sort of under the pressure and being able to work in this uncertain environment. And some of the local, this is the sort of the dialogue that we're getting from the interviews, is that it's such a siloed approach. So from one county to the next, they're doing incredible work in Sussex, and this was a comparative analysis with France as well. And same in France, you're seeing such great approaches, but there's not this national sort of guidance, if you will. which could be perhaps why some things are, you know, ended up being some incredible solutions came out of it. But that was my question, was just more of what is being done at the national level to then kind of have a more of a holistic, in terms of digital inclusion approach, so that these counties can kind of sort of have that dialogue, and rather than reinventing the wheel, can then have knowledge sharing and et cetera. So thank you very much. You've answered a lot of that, but I know there's more to be seen as well.
Thank you.
So I think the Greater Brighton economic area does make sense, but yeah, all parts aren't equal in that. It does make sense because of big employers like Gatwick and so forth, where people can live and access education in that area. But the affordability of that education and the affordability of the transport to those places and places of work, you know, that is what will make that area work and thrive and hum. So I think that the structure is right personally, but I just think that, you know, everything's stopped because no one knows what the government wants our economy to look like next year. So no one knows whether we want more nurses, whether we want more digital, whether we want more of this. No one has a clue, honestly. So local areas can think, well, we've got these strengths, but we don't really know. I think there is a sort of lack of where do we direct our energies beyond there. And then I think was the other one about the way that local authorities and local areas responded during COVID. That was really brilliant, because it harnessed a lot of digital behavior, working in networks, hyper-local action, looking after your neighbors, all of that kind of thing. It helped us each one teach one, getting people on Zoom and all of that. That there was a lot done around digital behaviors and cultures that was really positive during COVID. My impression of why the council was better then and perhaps not doing so well now during this winter of cost of living crisis is because during COVID, the political will and the public will was for those officers to focus on that one thing, on that one aim, and there was a shared objective across the organisation. There was a clear set of values of, like, these are the people in the most priority. If someone needs food delivered to their house, that's suddenly the director of whatever their day job is, main priority is to make sure that that happens, and then to make sure it happens tomorrow. Right now, though, what we're asking people to do is operate in councils, but also in our sector, is operate with huge deficit budgets, carrying massive vacancies, and we've put back the pre-COVID demands on everyone's shoulders. So you're saying to everyone, do everything you were doing before we had a massive traumatic pandemic, plus now there's a cost of living crisis and there's fewer of you working at what you're doing. So enjoy that. And surprise, surprise, everything's creaking and it's very difficult to innovate in that space.
So I just add something briefly on the kind of lack of the national strategy. So I'm part of, as well as working with the council on their digital inclusion strategy, which has, I think, got a lack of cash to spend on it, basically. I'm part of the Digital Poverty Alliance's kind of academic group who is looking at this issue, and people who are involved in this space at a national level. We look to Scotland, to Wales, to Manchester, where there's incredible joined up thinking, in London with the London Office of Technology Innovation, incredible joined up thinking, but there isn't a national strategy because there doesn't seem to be any kind of political ownership of this as an issue. And that's why I was saying the thing about the Obama administration saying, look, at a national level, we can do something about this, and we can provide not just kind of crappy social tariffs, which is what we have here, but we can provide fast, cheap, subsidised broadband to people on a national scale. So it's doable if there's the political will.
Brilliant. Thank you all. I think we have some, well, thank you for everyone for joining us for today, and for those who are able to stay on for this extra bit. Thank you for the panelists, to Simon, to Emma, and to Becky. If perhaps you're interested in attending some of the next Digit Debate events, I think Gemma's going to put some information up on the screen there. Please do join us for a future event, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So thanks all.